Okay, so we're going to take a simple example here that reads information. It reads in six number of hours worked by employees, reads it in from the user, and displays it out to the screen. And we're going to modify it so that our data is stored in an input file. So first I'm going to talk about creating an input file. The easiest way, there's lots of different ways you can use Notepad, you can create a text file within C++, but the easiest way to do it is the way I'm going to show you, because what it does is it puts the input file in the same folder as your project, and that's where it has to be located in order for this to work. So I'm going to go right click on resource files and choose add um, new item, and I'm going to come over here. I'm going to choose a utility file and a text file, and down here I'm going to give this file a name. I'm going to call it employeehours.txt. This happens to be where my project is located. That's the path, so that's where it's putting it. If your input file is not where the project is, that's the VCX proj file, then it's not going to work, okay? So I'm going to put some hours in here, like 10. I could do these on separate lines. I could leave spaces between them. Either way, they just have to be separated by white space characters. And I'm going to put a bunch of them in here. Okay. I'll do one more. There we go. Make sure that your cursor is here and you don't have any blank lines. And then you can just, do a file save or just click on save. All right. So here's my input file. Now I'm going to go back to my code here. All right. Well, I need to create an input. Well, let me talk about this. So we're trying to make this code a little bit more flexible so it doesn't work for just 6 employees. So I'm going to make the size of my array, I'm going to make it 25. Because let's say I work for a company that has, like, 15 or 20 employees. You want to make sure that this array is big enough to hold all of them. And then let's say you add a few employees, you want to make sure that it's still going to be a sufficient size. So you have to think about the size of your array. You don't want to make it too big. Like, you don't want to make it 2500. An array is a fixed size thing. It's going to save that much space in memory when your program starts to run. So it needs to be an appropriate size. All right, so I'm going to come up here and I'm going to include fstream, because I'm going to use a file, and I'm going to use an input file. And I'm just going to declare my input file stream variable to be called input file. And now I need to associate this variable with a file on my, in my project, which I just created, which is called employeehours.txt. Okay, so now every time I use this ifstream variable, it's going to refer to this file, which is the file that we created. All right, so I'm not going to have any prompts to the user here, okay, because I'm just going to read the information from a file. And this for loop goes through, well, now it goes through 25 times. We might not have 25 employees, so we really don't want to use a for loop. What we want to use is we want to use a while loop, so that we can keep reading until we reach the end of file marker. Now keep in mind, when you save this file, there is an end of file marker right here. You don't see it, but it is there. And so I'm going to change this to a while loop. And this is what the expression is going to be in my while loop. This will check for your end of file marker, okay? If it finds it, it returns true. But if it finds it, we want to exit the loop. So we're going to put a not in front of it. Well, I haven't found the end of file marker. I'm going to go through here and I'm going to put my code in. Okay. So we don't want to use CN anymore. And I'm still going to use my counter here. So let me just, because I took my initialization out of the for loop, right? I'm going to put that here and I'm going to anchor my countdown here. All right, so that's just changing, this while loop. I'm going to start my count at 0. Well, I haven't reached the end of file. I'll read that in, and then I have to increment it. Okay, so this is going to keep reading in from my file, storing it in the array until it reaches the end of file marker. Now, what happens here is count is going to hold the number of employees that were actually on the input file. So if I look at it, there's 15 of them. So when this while loop finishes, this guy's going to be 15. Now, just because I've used count as a counter down here, I'm just going to create a new variable to hold the number of employees. So down here, I'm going to say number of employees is assigned the value of count. Okay, because here's my loop where I display the information out, and I've used count as a loop counter. So, once I get this and I figure out what it is, in this case is 15, I want to store it someplace before I go into my next loop. Right. Now that's going to read everything in, and the difference here is we don't want to use number of employees, which is 25, because then we're going to get 15 valid hours displaying and 10 garbage values. Okay, because we don't have 25 things in our array. Maybe I'll just show you this now. Just so you can see what happens. Okay. Sorry, before I go any further, I have to be reading this in from my input file, not from CN. Okay, so now let's run it and see what it looks like. All right, so here's all my hours, and then I have a bunch of garbage values after them. All right, so what we want to be using here is when we read them in from the file, we need to keep track of how many things we read, and that's what we're storing in this variable number of employees. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to change this to number of employees, okay? And then I'm going to run it. And here you can see the hours entered that get displayed, and that's the data from my input file. All right. The one thing that you want to make sure that you do when you're working with input files is you always want to have an error check in there to make sure that you found the file and it was opened properly. If you don't check that and you have a problem with your code, you don't know if the problem is with your code or that it can't find your input file. So a lot of times students will start making changes to their program, and really the problem is just the file. So I'm going to put an if statement in here, and I'm going to say if not input file. And what that does is it'll check, all right, if the input file was found and opened correctly, this will return a true. Not true is false. So if there's a problem, it'll execute what's in this if statement. So I'm going to put in a cout statement. Okay. I'm going to put an del after this. Put in a system pause. And then I'm going to do use an exit function. And exit exits out of your program entirely. And the benefit to using an exit is just that if you can't find the file, you really don't want to go any further in your program. All right, so now I'm going to run this. right? Everything works fine. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this file name. So this should give me an error message. Error finding input file. Okay? So that's what we want it to look like. Again, make sure your input file is in the correct location. Some people might see some code that looks like this, and I'm going to show you this only because if you see it in a textbook or you see it someplace, this will do the same thing, right? Putting this in here, because once it doesn't find any more data in the input file, it will leave. I really am not a fan at all of that syntax. I think it's very hard to read and understand. So I would recommend using the end of file marker.